Yes. You think that since I'm a poet and I have done like tons of readings, I would know how to handle a mic. But every occasion is a new one. And of course, I did not check the mic when I came in, although I should have. My apologies. But welcome, 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 everyone. And if you are wondering what's happening, you are very welcome to come and join us here and take a seat for this amazing event that we're going to be having, all right, tonight. This is, of course, the 5th Singapore Literature Festival in New York City. It is organized, yay! Yes, we did the festival 2 years ago, purely online, and then finally we're back in person again, and it's so lovely to be able to be with everybody in this room. So this festival is organized by Singapore Unbound. You might wonder what Singapore Unbound is. It is a literary nonprofit based in New York City, and we devote ourselves to building cultural exchange between Southeast Asia and America. And we do that by doing a number of things. 2 main categories. We organize events, such as this one, and we publish. So we have a press called Gaudy Boy. Some of our books are there, behind you at the book table, so please take a look after this event. But back to the festival. The festival, which is held once every 2 years, a biennial festival, really aims to bring together authors and audiences for lively readings and conversations. Did my mic just go up? Okay, I will continue then, all right? And what are these conversations about? They're not just about literature. We also want to talk about the intersection between literature and society. And this year, we're so happy to partner with the People's Forum, where you are at the moment, the Evergreen Review, PN Review in the UK, NYU's Post-Colonial Race and Diaspora Studies Colloquium, and NYU's Asian Pacific American Institute, Singapore's Ethos Book, a really, really well-regarded independent press in Singapore, and the Asian American Writers Workshop to bring you this festival. The festival theme this year is Archipelago Dreaming. As the world becomes ever more interconnected and interdependent, the ideas of the Martinican writer and philosopher, Edouard Glissant, become ever more relevant. Calling for a change in our thinking, Glissant wrote, and I quote, "We need archipelagic thinking, which is one that opens, one that confirms diversity, one that is not made to obtain unity." And by that, I think he means a false kind of unity in which everybody marches to the same beat, everybody does the same thing. No, that's not what he wants. Instead, he said, a new kind of relation. That's what he's after. And we hope that this 3-day festival will build many, many kinds of new relation among us and offer us ideas for new relations when we return to our communities and institutions. There are events in the afternoon and the evening of each day of the festival. So today is the first day, and then Friday and Saturday. So please check your program booklet for details. It is entirely appropriate, I think, that we are holding most of this year's festival events here at the People's Forum. The People's Forum is a movement incubator for working class and marginalized communities to build unity across historic lines of division in this country and abroad. As an incubator, the People's Forum provides an accessible educational and cultural space that nurtures the next generation of visionaries and organizers who believe that through collective action, a new world is possible. Singapore Unbound certainly believes in the same vision, and we are very proud to partner with the People's Forum for this festival. Now, for the opening address tonight, unfortunately, due to a family medical emergency, Anthony Vani Capadeo is unable to be with us for the festival. We send them and their family our best wishes for their health and well-being. We're very, very happy and honored that the extraordinary, and I do not use that word lightly, the extraordinary Filipino novelist Gina Apostol, agreed to give the festival's opening address. I'm very sure that her talk tonight, titled Insular Fantasies, Capitalist Nightmare and Revolutionary Dreams, will give us a great deal to think about. But first, let me introduce you to tonight's moderator and a very, very good friend of mine, Vivek Narayanan. Vivek Narayanan teaches poetry at the MFA program at George Mason University. His books of poems include After, just published by New York Review Books, Universal Beach, and Life and Times of Mr. S. His poems, stories, translations, and critical essays have appeared in Poetry, the Paris Review, and the list goes on. He's published in many, many fantastic places, as well as in the Penguin Book of the Prose Poem and the Blood X Books of Contemporary Indian Poetry. Narayanan is also a member of Poetry Daily's editorial board. So would you please put your hand together to welcome Vivek.
Okay, now let's see if this poet fares any better with the mic. Thanks all for coming, and sorry for all the mix-up in the schedule, and it means that it moves me into a more uncertain space. But we have amazing, brilliant, incredible novelist Gina Apostol, and I think that you'll find the talk to be very generative and really thanks to G, and really looking forward to conversations we can maybe develop over the next couple of days. Gina Apostol has written 5 novels. She won the 2022 Rome Prize to work on a novel in progress, The Treatment of Paz. Her forthcoming book, La Tercera, is out in May 2023. Publishers Weekly named her last book, Insurrecto, one of the 10 best books of 2018. Gun Dealer's Daughter won the 2013 Penn Open Book Award. And her first 2 books, which have recently been reissued, Bibliolepsy and The Revolution According to Raymundo Mata, both won the Philippine National Book Award. I find the sense of the way she negotiates multiple locations so thrilling. She grew up in Tacloban, Leyte in the Philippines, and lives in New York City and Western Massachusetts, and teaches at the Fieldston School. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being here, and thank you for having me. Singapore Unbound, thank you, G. So it's called Insular Fantasies, Capitalist Nightmare and Revolutionary Dreams. People ask me what it means that my novel, Bibliolepsy, which was my first novel, which first came out in Manila in 1997 and was about that week in 1986 when a people power rebellion, a mass uprising on the streets, kicked out the 20-year Marcos dictatorship, is now out again in a different country, the US, in 2022, the year that the son of that ousted first dictator has been elected the new president of the Philippines. Talk about a nightmare. What we call the EDSA Rebellion of 1986 certainly has all the trappings of a fantasy plot, a fairy tale ending to nightmare. An opposition senator defiantly returns from exile in Boston back to the Philippines in 1983. He's shot on the airport tarmac in broad daylight by the dictator's goons, though the truth of the assassination is still shrouded, and only the dictator's cousin, General Fabian Ver, has been indicted, and the Marcoses have never been held to account in that murder. I remember the day my friend, his name was Cochise, yes, in the Philippines, people give themselves Apache nicknames, in that absurdity of the colonized that's still quite dizzying, came back from the airport. He was from the same fraternity as the senator, and their all-male choir took a trip to serenade their broad, as they call those alliances, on his historic return to the country. I remember he asked me if I wished to go with his gang of choir boys to the airport. He said they had room, and I said, heavens no. I was a teenage Maoist, as activism on my college campus went. I was no fan of that senator. I saw the exiled Senator Aquino as a bourgeois twat who would be no savior of the country. Cochise's face was ashen when I saw him again. I said, how'd the Harana go? Gina, Cochise said, you haven't heard. I said, no. Cochise said, and I remember the look in his eyes, a blank, dazed, and sleepless look, as if he'd woken up but had yet to shake off an unnameable horror. He said, Gina, it will not be the same country anymore. In 1986, when 3 years later, the widow of that senator, President Cory Aquino, emerged from the marches and the rallies, our new leader, a yellow-suited, nicely coiffed, bespectacled, mild-mannered, God-fearing, and unlikely pearl-clad avenger of her husband's bloody death, it seemed the country, in fact, had changed. In Manila, suddenly everyone was protesting on the streets: accountants, nuns, teachers, bureaucrats, corncob sellers, matronas from the gated villages, slippered men just hopped off from jeepneys. It was a fiesta of protest, a long-awaited typical Filipino street party with music, novenas, dancing, unsettlingly televised as a global spectacle seeking justice, truth, democracy. Students like us had been marching for years. And suddenly the country was awake, and there was a kind of great Piper feeling of people following our call's lead, end the Marcos dictatorship. We actually called it the US Marcos dictatorship for very obvious reasons. A princess brought to life by the romantic kiss of protest marches, a sleeping country rising out of its thorn branches of fear, assassination, corruption, greed, and lies, and slashing at the martial law brambles with posters, slogans, banners, rosary beads, chants, prayers, hope, and dreams. In my first novel, Bibliolepsy, begun when I was 19, in 1983, the year Aquino died, and finished in 1995, almost a decade after the EDSA revolt, I did bring up our hope's precarity. So in the novel it goes, if it is at all possible in a non-Heraclitean world to go back, to step into the same river twice, maybe when we do, we must ban all meanings, tropes, and symbols, the maladies afflicting EDSA. EDSA was the name of the revolt. Maybe if we can stem memory within some filtering contraption, a device of a sort for disinfection, by which we can flush out metonyms, similes, ugly, gigantic memorial statues, newspaper editorials, biblical references, mythical allusions, and this entire paragraph. Maybe then we might distill something more pure and light, closer to the original weight of a single minute on that street. The problem with epiphanies is that by definition, they cannot be shared. There was no national epiphany in February of 1986. There may have been a million revelations lodged quietly and inarticulately in each heart, which may be a flaw in the message, if you wish to see it that way. So you can see in that novel, one can see in my work that my belief in revolution is that it is communitarian. It comes from communal work and socialist aims. At the time of the snap elections, which ended in the first Marcos's ouster in 1986, when the widow Cory Aquino ran for president against the masterminds of her husband's murder, the Marcos political machine, the fact is, the Philippines' hard left boycotted her election. On one hand, I agreed with the analysis of the left. You see, Cory Aquino was the daughter of the Cojuangcos, one of the richest landholders of the country. In the 1930s through 1960s, the price of rice in the Philippines was more or less determined by her family's Hacienda Luisita. So expansive and controlling was their agricultural sway. One could easily see how a country led by a feudal oligarch would likely not lead to the progressive dreams we hoped for. Even as a kid in 1983, scorning the figure of Ninoy Aquino in an ironic yet truthful moment, I understood that. But while I agreed with the left's class analysis, by left in the Philippines, I mean the National Democratic Movement in the eyes of many personified by the founder of the Philippine Communist Party, Joe Masison, but in truth, in praxis, this movement is one of various skins and plumages, though joined to one anatomy, to use some of the imagery of Gramsci in his statements on political ideology. While I agreed with the left's class analysis of Cory Aquino as a kid then, and as an adult now, I disagreed with the strategy. At that historical moment, boycotting Cory Aquino left the left out in the cold. It explicitly set us outside the concrete and immediate possibilities of moving the new government more fruitfully toward the needs of those who have too long, been disenfranchised in a country run by a feudal, but also corporatist, pro-imperial and criminally oppressive, ethically bankrupt oligarchy. By not joining the mass protest in which all sectors, but definitely the loudest where the bourgeois were apart, we would have the cold comfort of being analytically correct, but historically wrong. So I marched on the streets. I marched for Cory. I understood those marches as necessary, even, and maybe especially, when at any moment while on the streets, we did not know if we would live or die. I think again about Gramsci, who said, "The truth is, one cannot choose the war one wants." I marched, even as I understood our aims were contingent, a means to an end. The election of Cory Aquino was not the end itself. The EDSA revolt of 1986 was, in a sense, a concrete fantasy, to use another of Gramsci's terms. It was a myth happening in real time that, in my view, enacted concrete and truly significant historical change, the ouster of a dictator. Not too many protests have managed to do what we did. It was a rare and truly moving and genuine fulfillment of a good, powerful dream. The change in Philippine hegemonic norms of that moment, moving us from passive consent to authoritarian militarism to active consent to bourgeois notions of freedom, justice, democracy, etc., is not a small thing. It was an important position from which to move the country into more genuine changes, the most important one being land reform, the redistribution of wealth from owners of the land to workers of the land. What happened in the years after 1986 proved the left's historical analysis to be correct. From the time of the landlord Cory Aquino on, the Philippine archipelago has only dreamed of change. We are still in that interregnum of waiting for it to happen, and the left were frozen out of that regime, which is a problem in the Philippines in that the issues of the left, land redistribution, resistance to dynastic wealth and structures, anti-imperialism, are key to any kind of ethical freedom and justice in the country. In Bibliolepsy, about this interregnum, I put it this way. The news traveled through the streets that the dictator had left. I recall dancing with a stranger in a red shirt, doing a kind of cha-cha in a wild, out-of-tune surprise. We swirled and pivoted, and when we found ourselves separated, we clapped. The stranger then bowed to me as the street continued to buzz. The dictator had left, airlifted out of the palace. Soon, of course, we discovered our error. On television, the man was still in our midst. We had danced to a false alarm. The rumors of his departure were sadly exaggerated. It was the next day that he left, the 25th, airlifted out of our lives by Ronald Reagan. Just to be clear, I do remember dancing in the streets when we erroneously thought the dictator had left. But then we saw him on TV, so whatever. He left the next day, which was even more surprising because I was asleep. I didn't know. All of my friends were out storming the palace, and I was still in my bed. Anyway, the country has been in an extremely long interregnum of that false alarm. It's now been 36 years. The slogans and posters and banners and desire have remained, but the reality is the structure of governance in the Philippines has not essentially changed. It is a robust nation of free expression in which the state slaughters journalists if it can, and if it cannot, or at least not yet, as in the case of Maria Ressa, it will harass them to kingdom come. 23.5% of Filipinos live in abject poverty. That's at least 20 million people. But most people live only slightly above that poverty line. That's around 80 million people. Most Filipinos are survivors of a cruel and rapacious system that does not serve them. Every election, it's those people who determine who will win the presidency. The land grabber, landholder, bureaucrat, boondogler, imperialist shill, dynastic oligarch, and their minions. Those are the people who live lives of comfort in the country, and it's they whose lives are threatened by change. It's they whose myth-making and golden promises manufacture consent to their greed and violence. On one hand, the election of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is just another in a line of dynastic oligarchs come to roost to disturb the archipelago's dreams. On the other hand, he is a figure of nightmare, of fascism, dictatorship, autocracy, state terror, a figure of dread we have long experienced and resisted. So when people ask me, what does it mean that the Philippines elected two children of dictators into power last May, Ferdinand Jr., the child of Marcos, and Sara Duterte, the daughter of Rodrigo Duterte, who is now Marcos Jr.'s vice president, the country is now run by two junior fascists. I think what's implied sometimes in that question is, what's wrong with Filipinos? And I resist that implication. I fail to blame it on the voters. I lay the blame squarely on the structural oppression that has produced the voters' poverty that leads them to the desperate hope that a Marcos with his lies about his family's gold will lift them out of their despair. Sure, there's cynicism in that vote. It is transactional, money is involved, political alliances of their aunts and cousins and grandfathers and in-laws, family and hometown and geographical loyalties that are part of the country's oligarchical machine politics. In addition, in this election, the dominance of Marcos Jr.'s trolls, the social media disinformation is a template of dystopia that is the Philippine reality. Marcos Jr.'s barefaced lies and their effects are straight out of Black Mirror. And there is, of course, the strong man ethos, the attachment to the strong that the world of the people in the slums move into. But elections in the Philippines are always about that fantasy. We have clung to these machines of democracy, the ability to vote, to kick out what does not work, to imagine someone new. It's significant that before Marcos's re-election in 1969, no Filipino president had ever won re-election. And that his 69 re-election, by the way, is hugely, hugely contested. But as a it's also important to see that intersection of archipelagic fantasy and fascist nightmare in this new historical moment, the election of another Marcos. As a novelist, what's been of interest to me, though, is the question of where that intersection comes from. I've spent the last few decades researching the revolutionary history of the Philippines. My fascination with that revolutionary history has been involved with thinking about answers. Why are we here? What makes us? What has constructed our ways of being? What constitutes our desire? How did we get here? The Philippines launched the first revolution against the colonizer in Asia. We went to war against Spain in 1896. Our allies in kicking out the Spaniards in 1898, in what Americans call the Spanish-American War, ended up occupying us instead, and we fought those amigos, the Norteamericanos, as the imperialist invaders were called in the documents, in a bloody, protracted war that the colonizer, the Americans, did not expect from 1899 to 1913. Reading about the Philippine-American War has given me insight into both countries, one in which I live, the other for which I dream. And my reading of Philippine revolutionary history tells me that the Filipinos' desire for change, for sovereignty, for freedom from the rule of others, was a powerful flower, a blossoming of incandescent hope. And I use this trope of nature, botanical terms, because there was something endemic of earth and bone and sinew in this uprising of a people. No one taught us to do it. We were angry. We had plots. We had family who fought with us. We had family who fought against us. It was a war of brothers, a war of mothers, a war of faith, a war of nothing. We had nothing but our will to be free in the soil on which we lived. The Waray song of patriotic hope, my language is Waray, is Aniringatuna, my mother, the land. Millions died for it. The revolutionary dream is our heritage. We enacted it ourselves on our own terms. It was a dream of nation, to be sure. It was not a dream of ending hierarchy or class inequality. We had problematic leaders in that revolution. We had intramural assassinations, but we were also never given our chance to enact the possibilities of that incandescent desire, kalayaan. Instead, we had the carnage of the capitalist. The imperial goal of the American occupation was to rape a land for its resources, to strip it for what it was worth. And what it was worth to the occupier was how completely it could be subjugated. I really wonder about the acts of genocide by US ideology, reading about the US genocide of peoples, from the history of the indigenous peoples in the United States, to the history of enslavement in the United States, to the history of anti-Asian hate that more or less shapes the 20th century of the United States, though it begins early, at the very least, in the so-called Victorian era. I wonder about this unbearable tolerance a people has for this rapacity. I wonder about it because I live in New York, and to be honest, I live well in America. I do not take my economic condition for granted here in New York, but I wonder about the genocide the US enacts because it is so irrational, so unbelievable almost, and yet also very coherent, very much part of the US's Constitution and its institutions, so all of a piece with its hegemonic purposes. US capitalism is a very coherent nightmare in which all of us here are a part. In 1898, William McKinley, a president very much in the pocket of corporations, prayed to God about what to do in the Philippines. And as McKinley puts it, God told him to occupy it. Benevolent assimilation was McKinley's oxymoronic lie about his pious imperialist adventure. One of his senatorial henchmen, Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana, was at least more candid. Mr. President, the times call for candor. The Philippines are ours forever. Territory belonging to the United States, as the Constitution calls them. And just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. We will not retreat from either. We will not repudiate our duty in the archipelago. We will not abandon our opportunity in the Orient. We will not renounce our part in the mission of our race, trustee under God of the civilization of the world, and we will move forward to our work, not howling out regrets like slaves, whipped to their burdens, but with gratitude for a task worthy of our strength and thanksgiving to Almighty God that He has marked us as His chosen people, henceforth to lead in the regeneration of the world. Can you believe this bullshit? This island empire is the last land left in all the oceans. If it should prove a mistake to abandon it, the blunder once made would be irretrievable. If it proves a mistake to hold it, the error can be corrected when we will. Every other progressive nation stands ready to relieve us, but to hold it will be no mistake. Our largest trade henceforth must be with Asia. The Pacific is our ocean. More and more, Europe will manufacture the most it needs, secure from its colonies the most it consumes. Where shall we turn for consumers, for our surplus? Geography answers the question. China is our natural customer. She is nearer to us than to England, Germany, or Russia. The commercial powers of the present and the future, they have moved nearer to China by securing the permanent bases on her borders. The Philippines give us a base at the door of all the East. Yay, Albert Beveridge. Anyway, in the name of these illimitable markets, the door of all the East, Northern Luzon was torched by the forces of Arthur MacArthur in 1899. Batangas was raised by the forces of Franklin Bell. He received the Medal of Honor for his efforts. Americans pursued the ragged guerrilla army of Aguinaldo through the mountains of Benguet to the plains of Palanan. They killed 30,000 people in Samar in revenge for 48 American dead in Balangiga in 1901. Pacification was the pre-Orwellian term Americans used for their brutality. War is peace, so Orwell says. What's interesting to me about the nightmare of subsequent American rule from 1899 to 1946 was that in the history books, it was called peacetime. Kamurayaw, as they say in my language. The structures of governance of that so-called peacetime was a military government in which policing and counterinsurgency, the need to subdue the rebels, spy on their families and communities, co-opt the people, and embrace and reward those who would betray their revolution, produced the country. The structures of governance produced by Americans in the Philippines, surveillance, counterinsurgency, the powers of policing are exactly what makes dictators possible. The other structure of rewarding the co-opted, the benevolent assimilators, the early adapters to America, the betrayers, produce oligarchy. Because of course it's those whose comfortable lives are threatened who will opt to be co-opted. There's a direct line from the history of US occupation to the dictatorship powers of Marcos, not only in the actual support for his rule by the US government in the 70s through the 80s, but also in the historical structures of counterinsurgent governance that allowed for the prolonged period of martial law and the fascist rule of Duterte. That the Philippines is a democracy in the sense that it elects its governments, at least for now, is part of what I'd call that insular fantasy, this belief in the ability to make choices, that our revolution is still in abeyance, a dream deferred, is not to say that we don't yearn for it, that it is not a dream lodged in the bones. It is there. It is in our history, genuine acts of resistance. But just as in the United States, so in the Philippines. The intersection of the fantasy of democracy with the nightmare of capitalism contends with the dream of revolution. Our job remains to enable, to seek, to pursue the revolutionary dream of societal change that counters hegemony and turns the world upside down, where the poor are free, the rich are constrained, and power is shared as it should be.
I'll just talk from here, if that's okay. Thank you very much, Gina. When I encounter your work, and I was thinking when you were talking right now, I was reminded of that other famous quote of Gramsci's, pessimism of the intellect and
Optimism of the will.
optimism of the will, sometimes it's translated. And I thought it in your case is somewhere like, it's sort of like pessimism of the intellect, vitality of the prose or something like that. That in one hand, in terms of your historical analysis, it seems bleak, it's pessimistic, because we have these sort of moments planted, in the colonial era that seem to keep coming back again and again and seem to be kind of persistent, But the way that you can write about them, or the way that your prose handles them sometimes seems to produce so much joy and vitality. It's not at all, it's not enervating. It's something about it which is enlivening. And I was thinking about that scene from Bibliolepsy, which you quote, where in 1986, something happens, a switch happens, and then suddenly all these people are out in the street, and it's a rebellion, and it seems, at least the way you describe it, sometimes it seems like a joyful rebellion. It's a joyful claiming of space, and even at that moment of writing that, there is the novel itself, even at that time, seems to know that this moment is not going to last, that it's going to get back to business as usual, or there's an ambivalence there as well. But I saw it again, that the persistence of the dream, that keeps coming back, and it has so much sort of so many resonances in terms of around the world as we were talking. The way that neo-fascism has established itself in India and so many places. So the return of something that we thought was gone. I remember hearing the African American poet Nathaniel Mackey saying, we thought we had put some of these things behind us, and now they're coming back. So so both those elements, the optimism of will, the joy of the prose, and pessimism of the intellect are in play. So I'm sure people have a lot of thoughts on this. I just throw out a couple of things. First, I was curious because I think your work seems to do this. It seems to exist in multiple historical periods, and it seems to be trying to set up a conversation between these moments or nodes. In terms of to go to 1986 and now, and the sort of return of the sort of new young fascist, as you said. So those two moments. Can you say a little bit more about how they're different and how they're similar, and how we read these?
Yeah. Well, just in terms of that, one thing that you're saying about joy, about the joy of the prose, I think counter-hegemony is a kind of joy. I think we need to. I think we need to revel in it. We need to revel in resistance. I think our moves into protest spaces, our moves into ways of saying "fuck you" to wherever we are. I think there's joy in saying in fucking people over, even in the small moments. So and partly the writing that I do is it's countering. It's kind of countering those forces. So that counter-hegemonic joy is what you might call that kind of art, and I felt it. I experienced this joy. I experienced this joy as a child. I experienced it the minute I stepped onto the streets, and that communality with others, marching. And I think there's an endorphin rush. I think it's bodily what happens when you're in a march, when you're marching with a lot of other people. And I think activists know that, to get people on the streets. Of course, my leaders, the leaders of our marches would go, "We need warm bodies." And I'm thinking, warm body is not a good term, but it is definitely the bodily experience of protest. I think is, for me, part of what I'm trying also to share in the novels, and the bodily acts of resistance. Let's say, even of the Katipuneros, even of the people in 1896, not even 1986, trying to capture what it meant for the body to be in that space, in among those grasses, and to think always about that physicality of resistance, which will include joy, which it will include the thrill and the rush, and also the desire to kill. So yeah, that's there too. I think that's kind of partly the space of writing that I do. In terms of thinking about the connections, the parallels of 1986, I think we talked about this before, and I'm sure people have noted this. The social media landscape, the fact of social media really does change things. The ways that you would use graffiti. You don't use graffiti anymore. Graffiti was really the thrill at that time, painting those, doing the spray paint. But, you do the memes now. And then, of course, you have the co-optation of of storytelling tropes, of meme-making tropes by the fascists themselves, and the use of strongman, that strongman position to gather, especially the masculine voices, to their cause. I think that's the difference between 1986 and 2022. I think also that interregnum, the 36 years where Filipinos, we never, well, our current constitution doesn't allow a president to run again. So it's 6 years, you can't run again. It used to be that you could be reelected, but after Marcos, the 1987 constitution said no more. And we've managed to keep that. So there's a kind of weird thinking every 6 years, something's gonna happen, something's gonna change. And and so that is a problem, that oligarchs remained. Oligarchs remained have remained the rulers of the country. And that the voice of the people who want land redistribution, who want the end of dynastic rule, et cetera, and there have been bills. There are bills that are constantly being put forth, ending dynasties. Yet you can't run anymore. You can't have one more person in your family running in the same town, because that's what happens. A whole town has the same family. So there are bills, there are things, but they never get enacted, So that the 36 years after 1986 is really also, I think, a material fact that makes the 2022, you have to think about the kind of, I'd call it rationality also of the voters, where they're going, 36 years, nothing's happened to us either, I'm gonna go with this dictator guy, and I don't remember his father, he's not his, all of these things that they do. So that's certainly something. I do think we should never, ever underestimate the thinking capacity of the voter. Because I think the bourgeois world in the Philippines is just saying, these are just stupid Marcos voters, they don't, you can't do that. Well, Gramsci himself, just going back to Gramsci, and it's kind of interesting to think about Gramsci right now, because he was, of course, the Italian Communist Party, and Italy is right now fascist again. But again, Gramsci would say, yeah, that's going to happen. I mean, the power of this hegemonic, the power of his kind of thinking about how we're co-opted. But going back to when Gramsci talks about the intellectual, for instance, and when he makes it very, very clear, categorically, that every man is an intellectual. There are different functions, there are different ways in which one functions intellectually. There's the person whose job is to be an intellectual, but every man is an intellectual, and you have to give credit all the time to that voter, and not just say, he's crazy, he's deranged. It's also crazy and deranged, to be honest, to vote for Marcos. There's something really crazy about it. But at the same time, you have to try and figure out they are also thinking. So how do you move into that thought? To be honest, it's really about economics. It's really about they don't want to be poor. And the strongman is saying, literally, Marcos said I'm going to give you back the Italiano gold that my father earned from being a great lawyer. It's like, fuck this guy. But I have friends who believe it. I have people from my hometown who say they're waiting for their Italiano gold. And so, okay, that's crazy. But the desire for that Italiano gold, where is it? It's because they don't have any other options. The country hasn't been giving it to them. And I think, I think the storytelling of the left, there's still space for it. I think there's still space for storytelling that could move people if you kind of keep the faith in people, and the tendency, I think, of the more, and I recognize that it might be not nice to put them in one category, the bourgeois, the groups that are for the opposition. The opposition right now is Leni Robredo. She's a woman who is a lawyer, not, by the way, petty bourgeois, not even landed, not even, just really someone who became a lawyer because she was talented, etc. She's been painted as like bourgeois, like upper middle class, rich lawyers, stuff like that. I mean, notice the storytelling that they're doing. They're creating this figure. It's not even her. Who's the one who's really, really, really like an autocrat, oligarch, stealer of billions? I mean, it's Marcos. But he's the one who's like sad. His father was ousted. His mother, So all of these things, and he has the Italiano gold that he's gonna give you. So they tell the story, and the story has to do with with economics actually. And I think you need to push it, and I still don't know how, to be honest. I think I think the instances of death are just going to be so big and so obvious. That's the sad thing. Like you were saying about India, how many deaths will it take till the canon, whatever? Sorry, Bob Dylan, but how many deaths is it gonna take? Yeah. Or you said, do I have a question?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
No,
Go ahead. Yeah.
no, you mentioned storytelling, and how part of this is also really the sort of failure of the left and of the liberal to be able to tell a story that is
I would
going to...
I would also not center failure of the left. I would also center the oppressive bullshit of Marcos. I would really always center the oligarch. I would always center the bullshit capitalists. I will also always center them. I would do the self-criticism of the left, among the left people. I will not be talking about the goddamn failure of the left.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I mean it as those of us in this audience,
Just us.
but I mean, but it brings me, because a question of, what can art offer in a moment like this? What kinds of creative resources can be offered for doing, a new kind of more creative politics, or some that thinks about new kinds of alliances?
It's very interesting because this particular dictator child, junior dictator boy, his father did it too. He's making films called like Made in Malacanang. So it's so Malacanang is the palace, is the presidential palace, and there's a maid, and it's her story and how she's observing the president. So sad, they had to leave the country. They're packing their bags. So they have that. So they're making movies, which is very smart because Filipinos do they love movies. Movies have always been actually they've been the most potent movers politically of Filipino reality, where people are just gonna watch those movies. The 70s Filipino filmmakers were amazing political thinkers and their art. So I think you're right. In the 70s, it was the movie makers. A lot of it was even comics. They would do it in the comics. There were a lot of great comics writers who would be, so there's just like this weird guy. His name was, I forget his name, but he's just like some hippie guy who's, always having these weird thoughts, but he's constantly kind of going against the mentality of the anti-drug Marcos, for instance. Marcos he was also going after drug people. That was another of his things, and just kind of countering the fascist dictates through being like a stupid hippie person. So there was a lot of that, and I think there was a kind of that long period of Philippine martial law, fascist rule also generated a lot of amazing popular art, street art too, street drama. There was one person who did like this romance of Bongbong. Bongbong's the name of this current annoying person who won the presidency, and Bongbong and Chris. Chris was the daughter of Cory Aquino, so they had like a weird romance of Bongbong and Chris. Anyway, so they would do these things. So there was a lot of interesting political work through comedy, through satire, and I think Filipinos. I think that's probably going to happen again. It was actually a beautiful, really intense ferment, artistic ferment, especially in visual arts, visual and performance art. In literature, it was more annoying. I think there's something, the literature in English can be problematic because it's very academic. It can be quite academic. The literature in Tagalog was a lot more powerful. In fact, I think Penguin Classics is going to come up with a translation of one of those Tagalog classics soon. But then in the 1980s, once my friends decided to go to march, because all of my friends were going, why are you marching? It's during the early 80s. And then 1983, that happened. 86, everyone was marching. And suddenly the writers in English started writing protest poetry. That's not a thing, really, in Philippine poetry in English. It's very T.S. Eliot.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not bad. It's actually pretty good T.S. Eliot poetry. But suddenly now they're all protest poets. So there was a shift, again, moving into a different political space. Because the thing about here's the co-optation of especially the writers in English, their co-optation by the Marcos regime because they were given money. They were actually his speechwriters also. Etc. So it was really the women journalists and the women artists, the women poets who would be who would do more protest because the men were making the money and then they would be writing the speeches for the Marcos regime. And the women were the ones who were very, they were pretty amazing. They helped topple that government, the women. And I think the thing that helped topple the government, and they are still around, are the young student activists. They are still there. They're very strong. They remain very strong. As we can see, even with the activism in Iran, etc., it's really the children. And it is true. It's sad that the bodies are being harmed. Young bodies being harmed. But I think that too is still happening. That's still there. So those are the things that are still there, I think, in the Philippines.
So I will start by opening it up for questions.
I'm holding a mic, so if anybody would like to ask a question, I will pass the mic to them. Go on, Anna.
First of all, thank you. That was enlightening. But you spoke a little bit about the shift of English language poetry from more of a T.S. Eliot style to sort of protest poets. And I was wondering if you find your own style shifting with the political landscape, or if you feel as though you use the same style to comment on different political.
Yeah, I wrote Bibliolepsy, and it was at the height. I began it, actually, it wasn't I didn't write it. It's a book about fucking, so it's a book about having sex with poets. And I really only wanted to write about books and reading. That was really what I wanted to do. And I needed a plot, and I used the rebellion for the plot. And because for me, the work is like an organism that has its own demands. So what you're trying to figure out is, you're trying to keep that organism alive, and it really does, for me anyway, that's my experience. There are things that the thing needs, and I'm trying to figure it out as I'm doing it. So my work as an activist, I just do it. I'm at the same time that I'm writing a book that's mainly about fucking, I'm on the street, not doing all that fucking, because you can't, it's hard. So what I'm saying is, the demand of art, which also requires a recognition, a reckoning with political reality, is not the activism that I think I would like to be doing. I do my activism on the street. I work with others when there's an issue. I try to help out however I can as a writer with different kinds of things that come up. By the way, we are boycotting Asia Society. I just want you to know that. Do not ever go. Stop your membership to Asia Society. They invited Ferdinand Marcos Jr. to dialogue with them with delight. They invited him with delight. And so we protested him. We have an open letter. You can sign it. It's on my Instagram. I only have Instagram because it's nice pictures. I don't have Facebook and Twitter. But they invited Marcos Jr. To dialogue. We asked them to revoke the invitation. They did not respond to us. We went and protested. They threw out protesters from their premises, security guards of Asia Society, like cattle. I watched them do that. They arrested 3 of them. And you know what? I watched these policemen. They were all of us, protesting, shouting, doing all the chants. When they stepped out, the policemen pointed at 2 different protesters, only the visibly queer. 3 gender nonconforming activists were arrested. Everyone else, so they chose certain kinds of people. So this is what I do. So in terms of my art, has my art changed with the politics? I've always been very political. All my art is political, but the work that I do has to do with the work and what the work demands. So you'll notice if anyone reads my work, this book is like that book, even the syntax will work. I recognize that, the syntax of this particular book is parataxis with only commas, no semicolons. So that's, that's what I will do. I'll just do that shit because I'm going, that's what it needs. This one is a lot of fragments, So it depends on the demand of the novel. I think the role of the writer in a society in the capitalist order is to always be aware in your person of your connection to possibilities of justice so that you will not side with power. Okay, but in doing so, that wholeness of your person and constantly criticizing yourself in terms of power, in terms of ways in which you are moving with power, not moving with power, that's part of your novel too. But the novel itself is its own creature and design. It will be moved. It will be moved by the political moment that you're in. There's no way out of it. You're kind of a really bad writer. If you're not, you may as well not do it and spare yourself the horror. But I think there's a kind of deflection that happens when you think about the writer. The writer has to be the one moving society. There's a deflection of one's own need to move into the communal space of protest and change. You, writer, you do it, So I think the question needs always to be a criticism, self-criticism, your own ways, because that's what I'm constantly doing as a writer, as a teacher at a very bourgeois school.
What school again?
Yeah, you too.
Complicit, yeah.
The complicity of that. I teach Marx every day to my students. They're annoyed. So I had one student who said to me, but how can we live without hegemony? I said, what? That is so crazy. How can we live without hegemony?
Yes, you're a very refreshing speaker.
Thank you.
Going on, as someone with an Anglo-American background, I think about the only time the left wing in this country was really making gains was under FDR. And what made FDR different is, or more powerful, I would just say, is that he didn't have term limits. So within my lifetime, my first president I remember is George Bush Jr. So to me, from my background, when you talk about term limits being something that is an important setter in Philippine politics, it feels like to me that term limits were done after FDR.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems like to me, that's the way that the bourgeois class
Mm-hmm.
sets parameters against democratic movements being able to do systematic change.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I think socialism, popularly argued in my generation, is democracy in the workplace. Is the problem not that like democracy electorally is limited through term limits in regards to the Philippines as well?
Well, I think there are different circumstances. You know, I think the context of America would be the problem with 1987 when that Constitution was done. I think it also has to be seen with what was going on at the time. We had just had 20 years of a dictator, and the term limit issue in the Philippines had to do with how can we not have this happen again. And so that was it was completely within that historic moment. He had also created a parliamentary system, and that parliamentary system, they also got rid of it. So there was a reaction to the Marcos rule, and so far, even Duterte has not been able to undo the Constitution, that particular aspect of the Constitution. He's done a lot of other things, but that particular aspect, being able to extend his time, we'll see, because his daughter apparently is a real bitch. The people are most afraid of her. My friends are most afraid of Sara versus Bongbong. You know, it's weird because there's Bongbong is bad, but Sara's real. She's evil. That's what they say. So Duterte hasn't been able to do that, and it remains a norm in the Philippines I find very interesting that norm has remained, that they've kept that democratic process, the voting, the term limits, etc. Because it seems it's interesting that with the states. I don't know about the whole, and I agree that FDR was definitely an interesting figure in terms of the issue of term limits. But I'm just saying that the historical differences matter.
Hi, Gina. If I may, can I call you that?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I'm Faris. I'm a PhD student, and I study the history of the Malay world. I'm from Singapore, like G. And thanks so much for that very illuminating presentation. There are many Malay scholars in Singapore and Malaysia who see their intellectual tradition going back to Jose Rizal.
Oh yes.
So
That's wonderful. Thank
yeah,
you.
so they claim a kind of solidarity with that historical moment in the Philippines and in Asia, which is which is part of a very rich revolutionary heritage, right? That the Filipinos have, that
Yeah.
many societies and peoples in Asia have. But it's also disturbing that in the matter of one or two generations, that revolutionary heritage or that memory of that revolutionary heritage has been lost. Of course, in places like the Philippines, it's not that long ago that the People Power Revolution happened, and now you have, the election of a kleptocrat's son in power. So I'm just wondering, like, what the conversation is like in the Philippines, thinking about or being puzzled at this amnesia almost, right? Because in places like Singapore and Malaysia, this is a constant conversation as well. That in the 60s we had such a robust socialist movement, and then now we're like nodes in global Western capital. So and this is a constant source of puzzlement for people who know this history. But what's it like in the Philippines?
Yeah, and it's happening all over too. As we see, and this return is happening. Italy, it happened. They have another Mussolini. They have another fascist party in power. Brazil's probably gonna keep Bolsonaro. Um, Only Chile, yeah, Chile. Um, uh, so there's something in this kind of world moment, obviously, that's happening. Uh, and so I think I'm sure people are studying, what's going on. I mean, for us, we can experience, the kind of fatalism that we have, or the kinds of sense of horror that we have, with climate change, with issues of womanhood, and all of these matters that seem to be going backward rather than forward. And your question was about the revolutionary.
Forgetting.
Yeah, I think it's really
forgetting,
about the
yeah.
amnesia.
Yeah, I asked my friends in the Philippines about. I did not understand. I left. You see, I left in 1987. So after the rebellion, I left. I came to the States for grad school, and then I went back and forth from the Philippines to the States. But the last 10 years or so, I did not understand that they did not change their history books. They didn't teach martial law. The Department of Education didn't really bother, it seems, to move the history and to make it clear to children what happened. And so apparently there was a huge kind of vacuum in their knowledge of history, of contemporary Philippine history. I think there's still a great knowledge of Rizal. To be honest, it is one of the saving things of as one writer says, Eric Gambalinda says, there are two things that keep Filipinos together: Rizal and gossip. Yeah, and Rizal definitely, gossip, yeah, but we do have, and to use Rizal has been very useful in keeping the memory of revolution alive. I just wish people would actually read him instead of just, talk about him, because Rizal is a really beautiful anti-colonial writer. He's a really important world historical writer that tells you a lot about that moment. That when I talk about the blossoming, it's really from to be honest, it's really from reading Rizal and his friends. And I'm still reading Rizal. I mean, I've already written one novel about Rizal. I'm writing. My next novel also has Rizal in it as a character, and it's really important to read him. But people are not actually reading him, and you need to read him in this way where you understand that he is always in a fascinating kind of contingent world. He's hugely dialectical in his ways of thinking about the argument. Because what he'll do, he has one guy arguing this, the next scene is going to argue the another way, the next scene is going to argue it this way, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a constant move in his novels. And he's the first, he wrote in Spanish, but he changed the concept of novel from one of the work of, because the French novel, which he really liked, was already very much a political novel, So Hugo, et cetera, they were really talking about the poorer people. So he fuses the French kind of anarcho-syndicalist, all of these kinds of worlds of the French political, literary, populist novels with anti-colonialism. And then he centers the Filipino. So he does a lot of different things in just 2 books, and he was very young when he was killed. He was only 35. So his first novel, which launched the revolution, because the Filipinos were they understood that he wasn't a guy who was going to go to war, but they understood that everyone else loved him and and were fired up by his novel. So they used his figure to get others to move into a war frame. He never really said, we should go to war now, but they wanted to go to war. They used his figure. They were very opportunistic, and he was killed. So they kind of killed him too. But it was good in some ways. The death of Rizal created a nation. It was bad for Rizal.
Perhaps the last question. What do you think, Vivek?
Yeah. Do we have any last questions? Thoughts?
Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could talk more about how living in New York has affected your work.
I love New York. I love going to museums. I love seeing my friends. I mean, G told me, Gina, can you talk to people 2 days? He talked to me on Tuesday. So, can you talk to them on Thursday? So I made my speech yesterday during Yom Kippur because I had no class. Because New York also doesn't have class on Yom Kippur. So yeah, just being able to be with friends, to share in these conversations. It's very enriching for a writer to have community. I love Singapore Unbound. Yeah, and it's just this whole kind of world of artists and activists, and even with the Asia Society, for instance, we got really mad. We have 580 people signing our petition. Within a day, there were like 300. Then people are rallying to the work that we're doing against Asia Society. Everyone should sign. And so I think there's a kind of richness to the activism in New York as well. The Filipino activism in New York is very cool. There a lot is always going on. The art, of course, in New York, I love. I am always art really fills me up. Going to plays, going to museums, et cetera. I love that about New York. I love the easy mobility. I hate driving, so I like New York. And it has also given me freedom, to do the work that I do. You can be quite also, when you're with the world that you grew up with, sometimes, you can be, I wasn't, obviously. I wrote Bibliolepsy, and I didn't care what my friends would say about fucking them over in my little portraits of them. But but there can be something constraining about being at home, something about it. Although I've only managed to really start my novels by being at home. That's odd. But I finish them away from home. But I start them at home.
That's very intriguing. If I can just follow up very quickly, when I was reading the end of your talk about being in New York, for me, it gave this familiar experience for those of us who are multiply located. That your country is burning, but you're around people who don't really seem to care, or you're trying to convince them, why should you care that your country is burning, or it's also too complex. There's a complexity that Americans have to engage with in order to be able to.
I'll just talk about the smallest things about the Philippines. I don't care. My novels are just gonna move right into that teeny tiny town that my mother grew up in. That was so crazy. It had no electricity until 1996, I end up really. People will just get very bored listening to me because I'll just talk about whatever seems to be interesting without really thinking about, oh, you don't know this, and I must cater to you, Mr. whoever you are, and I will center you. I refuse to do that, which is why I have counter-hegemonic joy. I have a nice life. I refuse to be in that space where I am constantly always having to think about, oh, you don't understand where I am from. I really don't give a flying fuck that you don't understand where I'm from. You will have to learn. You will have to learn. That's what I do. And I do that with my publishing company too. You know, they're very good. They know exactly how to work with my novels. And you people have to move towards you. You do not move towards them, because that is the end of your art. That's the end.
Sounds good. Okay.
Thank you so much,
Thank you so
Gina. Please give Gina a round of applause, everybody. And also to Vivek for actually moderating this wonderful, wonderful conversation. After this, we can please stay around. You know, there's a reception over here. Please help yourself to food and drinks. And Gina and Vivek will, also, of course, still be around. So please go up and continue this conversation. I think so many interesting topics have been thrown out. I'm sure you're kind of full of questions for Gina. I know I am. I'm so apologetic that because we actually asked Gina only 2 days before that we were not able to get her books for the book table. But you know her name now, Gina Apostol. You can Google her and you'll find all her books readily available on bookshop.org. Please get hold of them. Please read her, because I really think she is a very, very important novelist, actually, for us to get to know. There are other books too by other festival authors at the book table over there, as well as books published by Gaudy Boy. Please check them out. Judy is very, very friendly. All right, notice that she's masked, so she can't bite. So go and talk to her as well about all the various authors. Don't forget, the festival goes on tomorrow as well as on Saturday. We have events in the afternoon and the evening. All the details are in the festival program. I know this is a great, great, start to the festival, and it will, become even more and more rich as the conversation goes on. So please join us, all right, for the other events. Thank you, everybody, for coming.